So I just have to have, be aware that anything I teach can now be challenged.
This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. You can say this much about 2021. School board meetings have rarely been so lively.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
Time and again, we've seen folks getting heated over the idea of critical race theory, or CRT, in schools. I mean, parents are chanting, getting arrested, even breaking into song. Debate over CRT has been bubbling for a while, but it really hit the mainstream when former President Trump issued an executive order in September of 2020 banning diversity and inclusion training from federal contracts that include CRT. Since then, CRT has become a go-to culture war buzzword. One count showed the term was mentioned nearly 2,000 times on Fox News from April through mid-July this year.
Parents all over the country are standing up to the threat of critical race theory.
Parents and common sense Americans are pushing back against the destructive far-left critical race theory.
You don't want critical race theory taught in your schools to your children.
All this hype around CRT has led to legislative action on the state level, with more and more states introducing or passing laws to ban CRT from school curriculums. But the language used to interpret CRT differs, and it's difficult to get an exact count of how many pieces of legislation there are. But as much as CRT gets mentioned and now legislated, it actually isn't taught widely in US schools. According to an Association of American Educators survey released last month, 96% of teachers say their school does not require them to teach CRT. Keep in mind, CRT is a pretty narrowly defined concept, and its uses and teachings are also pretty specific and rare. The American Bar Association says that CRT acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. CRT is sometimes taught in higher education, often in law school, and as disinformation about it spreads, scholars are warning about the harm this could cause. But while CRT isn't widely taught in grade schools, the conversation around it definitely puts a spotlight on what is being taught in American schools, because some of the curriculum around race and history is pretty notable, and it's been around for a long time. For one, research shows curriculum around Native Americans is super outdated and often flat out wrong. One study shows that in K-12 schools, 87% of history taught about Native Americans is from before 1900. Scholars say this presents Native Americans as a long since forgotten episode in the country's development, while there are 574 federally recognized tribes across the country right now. Another noteworthy stat on what the kids are learning, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, only 8% of high school seniors can identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. And other studies show that other minority groups are also largely just as underrepresented in American schools' curriculum. A lot of this comes down to who is controlling what's in our textbooks. California and Texas have the biggest textbook markets in the country, and that's where most of them come from. But each state has the right to revise and adjust the text as they see fit. Like when Texas officials approved a controversial lesson from textbook publisher McGraw-Hill in 2015 that referred to enslaved people as workers in one of their books, saying the Atlantic slave trade brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. I'm sensing a theme here. There's still a lot of room for improvement in how K-12 students are taught accurate historical information. So no, the stats would say CRT isn't being taught in your local school district, but there are a lot of reasons to pay attention to school curriculum around race and history in America. We want to go a bit deeper on CRT, and here to talk to us some more about it is Dr. Brenda Walker. She is a professor of exceptional student education program at the University of South Florida. Dr. Walker, first and foremost, thank you for joining us. I want to make sure that we kind of set the right foundation for this conversation. My first question, why was CRT created in the first place? And where exactly is it taught?
Okay, great questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, CRT, critical race theory, was developed in the 70s by a group of legal scholars. And it was originally intended to provide a framework for uncovering injustices in the legal field and really debunking the notion that justice is blind, that justice is colorblind. So that was the original intent. Since then, it has evolved into other disciplines, and in particular, my discipline in the field of education.
I'm curious to know if you can speak to some of the critical history of CRT. What is the critical history of this academic framework?
One of the principles of critical race theory is that we are to honor counter narratives. So, in other words, that we are to honor those who've been most marginalized and listen to and honor their lived experiences and stories.
How exactly did misinformation begin to spread about CRT?
Well, I think more recently, after the very tragic murder of Mr. George Floyd in particular, critical race theory is looked at by some as it's become like a lightning rod for criticisms about race discussions in the classroom. And one of the misperceptions is that critical race theory is something that's taught in K-12 schools and classrooms, and that's not the case. I'm in and out of schools all the time. I'm a teacher educator, and I help to prepare principals. I've never gone into a K-12 classroom and heard a teacher having a discussion about critical race theory.
Wonderful. Dr. Brenda Walker from the University of South Florida, giving us some very useful, very valuable context to further understand critical race theory. Thank you so much for joining us. The school year is right around the corner for Texans, and a new state law banning CRT has some teachers worried about how that will affect classroom discussions. The bill doesn't mention CRT explicitly, but if passed into law, it'll put restrictions around discussions of race, gender, and current events. Newsy's Willie James Inman spoke to teachers who were speaking out against the legislation.
What House Bill 3979 does for me is it basically takes away my privilege of teaching. I'm having open and honest dialogue and conversations with my students.
Lakeisha Patterson is a teacher in Texas, and she's just one of many voices pushing back against a new law that some teachers say is politically motivated and confusing. Texas House Bill 3979 seeks to ban CRT, or critical race theory, in Texas classrooms. CRT is an academic framework that examines systemic racism within society, something that educators say isn't used in K-12 schools. The text of the law does not mention CRT, but it does direct teachers to talk about topics including the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers, and the writings of Frederick Douglass, to name a few. The law also puts up barriers on how teachers can discuss racism and current events in the classroom.
Even the fact that I'm an elementary teacher, and I get it that my kids are younger, these are still sensitive subjects that I think they should be made aware of, and we should have the ability to have open and honest conversations about historical events that happen.
We talked to Diane Birdwell back in July of this year. Since then, she's petitioned state lawmakers to stop targeting teachers, with additional laws being proposed during a special legislative session earlier this summer.
Let us teach without being dominated by the state of Texas legislature.
Birdwell believes the motivations behind the law are political and have nothing to do with what students learn in the classroom.
When I explain to people what CRT really is and how it's not being taught, they calm down, they relax. But that's not what they want. They want a riled up base. And so they're just going to keep throwing things until they see what sticks.
As a world history teacher, she says the new law will most likely not affect her teaching, but she's still concerned.
So I just have to be aware that anything I teach can now be challenged, and not just by the parents of my students, but, outside of the district.
Governor Greg Abbott has vowed to target CRT again during a second special legislative session that began last week. Additional legislation failed to move forward during the first special session after a group of House Democrats fled the state. HB 3979 is set to go into effect on September 1st. Willie James Inman, Newsy, Washington.
All right, we're going to put a pin in the CRT conversation for right now. When you're back, we'll put our focus on the impact of the Delta variant at this point in the COVID-19 pandemic.